Oi Caveboy Chapter 12. If you remember from Chapter 11, the No-Necks are coming to invade the village. Turned out that the new chief, Borg, was rubbish and all he wanted to do was run away. So Iggy stepped up and started to try to say that he had a plan. Nobody was really listening, but luckily Hammerhead had managed to recover enough to tell everybody to listen to Iggy. Chapter 12. What's that coming over the hill? Iggy had been astonished as anyone else at Hammerhead's sudden appearance. In fact, what had happened was this. Shortly after Iggy and Hubba had left the cave, the chief had regained consciousness. The fever had left him weak, and he felt like someone emerging from a long, deep sleep. Tottering to his feet, Hammerhead had trodden on something on the floor. It was the body of a black scorpion, which he dimly remembered killing with the axe he kept by his bed. A terrible stench of dead fish filled the cave, and it made him want to get out before he threw up. Dragging himself down the hill, he'd been surprised to see people running around like frightened ants and babbling about an invasion. That was the moment Hammerhead had felt dizzy, and he leaned on the standing stone a little too heavily. The Urks had no doubt it was a sign from the gods. The sacred stone had fallen, and their chief had appeared to them like someone back from the dead. He had spoken the words they must obey. Fight like men, listen to the boy. As a result, Iggy suddenly found he had a captive audience. The tribe hung on his every word, as if they believed he alone could save them. There was no time to be nervous or to wonder if his plan would work. He issued instructions and drew pictures in the dust. Soon men were cutting down branches and fetching bundles of fur from their caves. Women worked feverishly, threading the furs together to make what soon began to resemble a giant furry patchwork quilt. Later that evening, as the shadows grew longer, the No-Necks swarmed across the river, with their spears and axes held above their heads. Crack led the way, keeping his eyes fixed on the hills above for any sign of the enemy.
Mena Husha,
he said. It's quiet.
Vera Husha,
came the reply. Too quiet if you ask me. They stole up the hill, silent as wolves in a library. But when they reached the Urk camp, it looked deserted. Tools and flints lay abandoned on the ground. The fires were out, and nothing stirred but the cold wind.
Klug,
commanded Crack, and the group hurried off to search the caves for anyone hiding. A few minutes later they were back, shaking their heads.
Scalper,
they grunted. Crack looked unconvinced. His eyes swept over the valley, watching the trees and rocks for any sign of movement. His instincts told him this was too easy. He spat on the ground, missed and wiped his foot on the grass. Half a mile up the hill, the Urks waited in the woods, trying not to tremble too loudly. You sure this will work? Whispered Iggy's dad. Yes, said Iggy. Hopefully.
hopefully.
Well, I've never tried it before, said Iggy. Well, only on a snake.
Dung and blood,
groaned Dad, rolling his eyes. What do you call them things? Clatterpults, whispered Hubba. They're deadly. Iggy held up a hand for silence. He could hear their voices. The No-Necks were coming up the hill, just as he'd expected. Crack wouldn't be satisfied. The Urks were gone until he had searched every inch of the valley. Iggy peered out through the trees as the enemy came into view. He could hear their bone bracelets rattling like teeth. Now? Hissed Hubba. Iggy shook his head. Wait for my signal, He raised his hand high, then brought it down swiftly. "What's the signal?" whispered Hubba. "That was the signal." "Oh, you mean now?" "Yes, now! Now!" "Fa-tang!" The twang of 50 jawbone catapults firing at once was a sound that the no-neck had never encountered. They halted uncertainly and looked up. Something dark rose out of the trees and into the sky. It could have been a flock of crows, but it wasn't. Struga! The next moment they yelped and ducked as 50 donut-sized rocks came pelting down on them. Most of the no-necks dived to the ground or ran for cover, but no sooner had they got to their feet than they were hit by a second bombardment, as painful as the first. "Ugga flogger! Scarper! The sky's falling on us! Run!" "Ouch! Oh!" The no-necks turned and would have fled if Crack hadn't driven them back, promising he would personally split them down the middle with his axe if they gave up. They came back reluctantly, nursing their bruises, and watched the sky in case it fell on them once again. Like most tribes, the no-necks believed in magic, and they didn't like the look of this magic one bit. Crack had spotted that the attack had come from the woods. He pointed his spear forward, ordering his men up the hill. "Onga!" They didn't get far. From somewhere in the trees came a noise that struck terror into their hearts. A long, drawn-out snarl, like the roar of some savage beast. The advance faltered, threatening to become a retreat. Even Crack looked shaken as the ground trembled. A moment later, they saw it rise over the crest of the hill. A brown, shaggy monster, as big as a house. "Mammoth!" cried the no-necks. They'd seen mammoths before, but never one as ugly or misshapen as this. One tusk pointed upwards while the other seemed to be signalling left. It came over the hill, wobbling and shaking, its shaggy coat flapping like a tent. The no-necks backed down the hill. The beast had reached the top of the slope and was gathering itself to charge. A charging mammoth can reach a top speed of 50 miles an hour, but no one seemed to have told this one. It thundered down the hill like a runaway caravan, bumping and rocking and shedding lumps of fur. "Struga!" yelled Crack, hurtling his spear. "Scalper!" screamed the no-necks, dropping their weapons and scattering in terror. "Attack!" roared Chief Hammerhead, as the Urks burst from the trees, waving their axes and uttering their famous war cry, "Ugga ugga oggy! Urk urk urk!" In less than 10 minutes, the Battle of Urk's Wood, 10,002 BC, was over. The no-necks fled down the slope, plunged across the river, and were last seen disappearing into the forest.